Under the dying light of a neutron-drenched star, the Galactic Council convened in what was supposed to be an emergency session. Instead, it had become an open theater of dysfunction. Representatives of over 300 species shouted across the amphitheater, translations overlapping, voices feeding chaos. The chamber's sound-dampening tech, engineered for civil discourse, struggled to contain the roar. Dozens of interpreters flickered between languages as delegates pounded consoles, gestured wildly, or stormed out entirely. The crisis was no longer theoretical. It wasn't on the edge of the galaxy anymore. 3 core systems had already gone dark, their populations either evacuated or presumed consumed. No confirmed imagery survived contact. What data remained was fragmented and terrifying. Biomechanical constructs that rewrote matter at a molecular level, reconfiguring starships and planetary crusts into tangled latticework of unknown function. The phenomenon moved with purpose, but not intention. No demands. No signals. No origin. Just silent, recursive consumption. Some called it the N-Light Swarm. Others refused to name it, as if doing so gave it power. The Council's response? Debate. Not strategy. Not action. Debate. Centauri and Varnic factions blamed each other for lax border protocols. The Karel refused to evacuate their moons, citing ancestral sovereignty. The Drult demanded compensation before offering any defense fleets. A half-dozen minor species threatened secession if their concerns weren't prioritized. Every minute spent arguing widened the rift between survival and extinction. High Chancellor Vurok of the Cinder Dominion slammed his six-limbed fist into the diplomatic dais, shattering its surface plating. No one noticed. His species, known for composure, had already begun retreating to fortified sectors. A silent evacuation cloaked in bureaucratic phrases like resource consolidation and logistical refocusing. The rest of the Council followed suit, hoarding defenses and disengaging from collective obligation. In theory, they were united. In truth, the Galactic Council had become a room full of escape pods trying to launch before the ship exploded. Humanity's name surfaced once, dismissed instantly. They lack strategic depth. A Mafari diplomat sneered. They have no grasp of galactic-scale logistics. They barely function as a cohesive species. Another delegate offered, to nods of agreement. What would they contribute beyond more confusion? Humans had observer status. That was all. A courtesy title granted after their application was almost forcibly insisted upon. Too loud to ignore, too unstable to fully admit. Their sector was underpopulated, their technology crude but fast evolving, and their cultural exports, a baffling stream of satire, violence, and dark humor, left Council analysts perplexed. When Earth's name appeared on the roster of emergency delegates, a minor functionary quietly deleted it from the agenda queue. No one objected. The assumption was universal: humans couldn't help here. They were too new, too reckless, and too far removed from galactic politics to comprehend the nuance of such a dire threat. Better to let the major civilizations manage it. Or, more accurately, fail to manage it. The truth? No one knew what to do. And that was the secret the Council refused to acknowledge publicly. The archives showed nothing like this. The AI wars of the Seventh Ecliptic had boundaries. The black hole bloom was slow. The collapse wave at least followed thermodynamic rules. But this was something that unmade everything it touched, not just physically, but systemically. It unraveled social order before it even reached a species. Panic had outpaced logic. Even the Veon Collective, masters of calm long-term forecasting, had stopped transmitting updates. The Council was out of ideas. A message pinged into the chamber's central queue, unauthorized, unscheduled, and improperly formatted. Most delegates ignored it. Those who glanced at the metadata frowned. Origin, Sol System. Relay Path, Civilian Comnet. Encryption, rudimentary. Another human PR stunt, someone muttered. But someone accessed it. A junior technician, perhaps out of curiosity or boredom, authorized the link. For a brief moment, Amidst the storm of political collapse, a voice, clear, low, and unmistakably human, began to speak. Not from a podium. Not from a council seat. From a remote link, grainy and unimpressive, came the calm, confident tone of someone who had expected not to be heard, but intended to make it impossible to ignore. And for the first time in weeks, the council chamber fell quiet. The humans had always been an anomaly in the galactic archives. Not because of their biology. Bipedal carbon-based organisms were common. Not because of their technology, primitive by interstellar standards, though accelerating unnaturally fast. It was their pattern that disrupted predictions. Models designed to project societal behavior across civilizations failed repeatedly when applied to humanity. Where others followed linear paths of development, humans lurched. Where most cultures responded to external threats with caution, humans reacted with aggression, irony, or inexplicable innovation. Their history wasn't one of stability, it was one of surviving their own worst instincts, and then engineering those instincts into strengths. The Council had quietly observed humanity for decades before formal contact. What they saw unsettled them. The human timeline was punctuated by wars of annihilation, planetary-scale pollution, ideologically motivated genocides, and still, they survived. Worse, they adapted. Systems that should have collapsed under their own contradictions instead mutated into new forms. Democracy and autocracy coexisted. Faith and science clashed and yet produced breakthroughs. Unity was a myth on Earth, but coordination still occurred when stakes demanded it. Their file was marked, culturally unstable, behaviorally non-deterministic, ideologically fluid. The Threx campaign sealed the early reputation. After a routine misunderstanding escalated into armed skirmishes, the Threx prepared to glass 3 human colonies as a warning. In retaliation, humans didn't respond with overwhelming force. They responded with absurdity. They hijacked Threx media networks with music, memes, and cultural references that short-circuited translation AIs. Entire Threx naval units were crippled by communication malfunctions caused by recursive joke loops and language traps embedded in what humans called satire. The Council watched as Threx diplomats, previously renowned for stoicism, withdrew entirely from human interaction. The campaign ended without a treaty, without a surrender. Just an informal ceasefire, and the unspoken decision to avoid provoking humans again. Another incident, the nanoplague. A containment breach on Vega 5 threatened to spread across the system. Council protocol mandated isolation and orbital sterilization. The humans ignored protocol. They deployed modified incendiary drones and manually collapsed 3 fusion reactors, vaporizing 2 cities to halt the contagion. Millions dead, an atrocity by any measure. But the nanoplague stopped. Every major power condemned the act. Quietly, however, Council archives appended a new descriptor, willing to sacrifice entire population zones for strategic containment. There were smaller, subtler patterns too. Psychological studies failed to capture the human disposition toward absurd resilience. In simulations of social collapse, most species fell into despair or tribalism. Humans, unreliably but often, developed humor. They joked in shelters. They recorded videos during pandemics. They mocked their own suffering. Council sociologists, baffled, created a new research category: mirth under extreme trauma. Technologically, humans weren't impressive at first glance. Their starships were inelegant, their FTL drives inefficient, their AI narrowly focused. But their pace of iteration was relentless. They did not perfect systems. They launched flawed prototypes and improved mid-use. They were, according to one Silithian engineer, a species that debugs reality in real time. It was this trait, their refusal to wait for perfection, that the Council found most disturbing. Because it wasn't rational. It wasn't safe. And yet it worked. Culturally, humans resisted centralization. The Council's own structure, a legacy of species with strong collective governance, was alien to Earth. Humanity functioned as a patchwork of conflicting governments, corporations, alliances, and independent actors. There was no single point of contact. No singular Earth policy. Just a chaotic, shifting consensus driven by urgency and emotion. This made diplomacy maddening. But it also made control impossible. In a galaxy where most wars were won by disabling a species' central node, humanity presented no such target. Their media further confused analysis. They fictionalized their own extinction obsessively: films, games, novels depicting apocalypse, invasion, and collapse. Council scholars theorized this was a form of psychological inoculation, rehearsing fear to desensitize themselves to it. If true, it worked. Humans remained calm in situations that drove others to paralysis. When first contact with the Rith ended in violence, and 2 ships were lost, human survivors recorded audio logs in which they debated rescue plans while quoting fictional space operas. This strange mixture of volatility, pragmatism, and cultural noise earned them both fascination and dismissal. They were never expected to contribute meaningfully to high-level council initiatives. They were tolerated, monitored, occasionally consulted for outside-the-box perspectives. Never trusted with leadership. Never imagined as a solution. Which is why, when the council faced a crisis it couldn't classify, couldn't predict, and couldn't survive by protocol, no one thought to ask the humans. They had always been the outlier. And the council had forgotten that in every dataset, the outlier is often the key. The voice that cut through the silence was not on the docket. It was not vetted, cleared, or welcomed. Yet no one stopped it. Something in the tone, the steady cadence, the lack of panic, compelled even the most jaded delegates to listen. It belonged to Lyra Westgate, human representative, in name only, a former naval strategist turned emergency attaché. She wasn't authorized to speak. She did anyway. She introduced herself with no titles. She didn't appeal to protocol or tradition. She spoke plainly, almost coldly, about the facts no one wanted to acknowledge. The council had no plan. The end light was not slowing. The defenses were fragmenting. Each species was prioritizing survival and isolation, even though the threat rendered isolation meaningless. She outlined the symptoms: interstellar routes decaying into silence, automated beacons failing in perfect synchronization, entire fleets vanishing without a trace. She then explained, without embellishment, the projections: less than 3 standard cycles before the swarm reached central systems. No predictive model offered survival under current council strategy. Because there was no strategy. Just panic disguised as politics. She didn't offer reassurance. She offered a choice. Westgate proposed what she called a live force synthesis operation. Not a weapon. Not a fleet maneuver. A binding. One council session, every delegate, forcibly linked into a simulated outcome cascade built on human neural trauma compression. A human-developed tool, originally created for high-stress command teams during nuclear standoff drills. It didn't teach consensus. It enforced empathy. It broke mental resistance by making participants live through projected futures, fully, emotionally, and at times fatally. Synthetic, but real enough that most never exited unchanged. The council erupted. Such simulations were banned. The psychic trauma alone would violate 5 interspecies accords. No species had ever willingly subjected its leadership to cognitive override of that magnitude. To do so without consent was viewed as an act of war. Westgate interrupted without raising her voice. She reminded them they were already at war. Only not with each other. Not with ideology. With extinction. The council demanded precedent. She cited none. She simply stated that humans had used it, once. Not on enemies. On themselves. During a cold containment crisis on Earth's Mars colonies, when civil war loomed, and nukes were primed, a neural cascade was deployed across 12 conflicting leaders. They emerged with a resolution within 90 minutes. 2 retired. 1 never spoke again. But no one fired a weapon. It wasn't humane. It was effective. That distinction, she said, was the only one that mattered now. Delegates demanded to know the real motive. No species offered such a tool without leverage. What did humanity want in return? A seat? Resources? Favor? Westgate answered without pause. Nothing. Humanity would not lead. They would not negotiate reparations. They would not exploit the outcome. They only asked that the Council choose. Not later. Not in committee. Now. Silence returned. Not because the Council agreed, but because they didn't know how to respond. The idea was grotesque. Reckless. And yet, it was something. A vector, where no others existed. The major blocks splintered. Private channels lit up. Arguments flared behind encrypted links. A vote was demanded. It wasn't official procedure. It wasn't formalized through proper delegation. But the crisis overrode formality. Within minutes, over 2/3 authorized a provisional trial. The swarm's advance left no room for elegance. The cascade would be deployed on site. Any delegate who refused participation would forfeit their system's voting power for the duration of the crisis. Even then, many hesitated. Until Westgate added one final condition. She would enter the cascade first. Not as a controller. As a subject. If it failed, her mind would break before theirs. Not everyone trusted her. But in that moment, they believed her. Because humans lied, exaggerated, and provoked, but they didn't bluff about stakes they were willing to die for. Consent was logged. Systems aligned. The neural interface, crude by Council standards but functional, began initialization. No one truly understood what came next. But they understood one thing clearly. They were out of time. And the only race that didn't seem afraid to face the end was already reaching for the plug. When the neural cascade activated, protocol dissolved. There were no opening statements, no carefully worded introductions, only immersion. The technology didn't simulate possibilities, it forced them. Not through logic trees or predictive models, but by grafting projected sensory and emotional outcomes directly onto the participants' minds. Within seconds, every delegate in the council chamber lived through dozens of failure scenarios. They felt the heat of obliterated atmospheres, heard the final cries of their species, tasted air turning to static as planets were unmade around them. It wasn't a vision. It was a shared death, repeated until the resistance broke. Each scenario adjusted in real time, adapting to the psychological architecture of the user. Some species experienced the loss of progeny. Others faced the collapse of ancestral memory networks. For the Vorner, the cascade simulated the extinguishing of their soul fractal resonance, an extinction not just of life but of metaphysical identity. The Relathi, who had never known war, were made to feel it from the inside out: fear, rage, futility. Every failure sharpened the neural feedback. The pain wasn't physical, but it was precise. It went where logic couldn't reach. Within 20 minutes, a quarter of the delegates severed their links voluntarily. A few collapsed. One died from neuroshock. The cascade adjusted again, lowering intensity but increasing temporal compression. Delegates now experienced centuries of consequence in mere seconds. They were shown what the galaxy would look like not only after they failed, but if no one ever remembered they had tried. Then it shifted. Human algorithms had built in a pivot point, a decision node. After the trauma, the simulation offered branches. Not success. Just attempts. Coordinated defense strategies. Resource unification. Asymmetric countermeasures drawn from hundreds of years of human insurgency data. Psychological resilience campaigns. AI network decentralization. None guaranteed survival, but all showed one thing clearly: unity, even late, worked better than brilliance applied in isolation. Delegates didn't discuss. They didn't need to. Their minds, bound in shared experience, began aligning involuntarily. Species whose philosophies were diametrically opposed began forming neural bridges. The Vari, who believed in predestination, and the Fantari, who rejected causality entirely, jointly simulated a unified defense grid based on stochastic forecasting. The Galtef, once isolationist, proposed opening their cryofleets for council-wide evac protocols. The previously intractable Gel Coalition voted, unanimously, to share their dark matter conversion data. It wasn't peace. It was momentum. When the cascade ended, no one spoke immediately. There were no cheers. No relief. Just stillness, the kind that follows revelation too large for language. Some delegates wept. Others simply stared at nothing. The simulation had stripped away pride, cynicism, and the illusion of permanence. The first to speak wasn't human. It was a Kalari echo priest, whose species viewed emotion as sacred profanity. His voice trembled as he asked what humans had endured to design something so merciless. Westgate didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her vitals were stabilizing, but her neural activity showed residual bleed. She'd absorbed a portion of every projection, even those not her own. A council medic whispered that her cognitive signature might never return to baseline. That wasn't a surprise. The cascade wasn't designed for observers. The council didn't return to normal. That structure no longer applied. Emergency measures were passed without resistance. Authority was redistributed. A temporary central command was established, not dominated by humans, but modeled on their crisis doctrines. Flat hierarchies. Autonomy within purpose. Action prioritized over debate. All data was shared, including previously classified tech. The unity wasn't idealistic. It was strategic. A survival machine assembled out of necessity. But it worked. For the first time since the swarm appeared, response vectors emerged that offered more than delay. The humans offered logistical support, no command, no conditions. They deployed engineers, AIs, and orbital mesh nets designed for rapid infrastructure. Their fleets were smaller, slower, but oddly efficient. They adapted in real time. Council analysts began noting that the humans weren't improvising, they were practicing. Everything they built felt temporary, like they knew it would break, and that was part of the plan. The galaxy had pivoted. Not because humans were the strongest. Not because they were the wisest. But because they had stared into annihilation and learned how to build while bleeding. And now, finally, they weren't building alone. The counteroffensive didn't begin with a battle cry or a fleet deployment. It started with silence, intentional, focused, and coordinated. Every major system routed non-essential traffic into black archives. Communications narrowed to tight beam exchanges and encrypted bursts. Civilian sectors were shifted into passive defense states, while industrial output redirected toward modular adaptability. The swarm had proven impossible to outgun. So the Council, now functioning more like a coalition task force, didn't aim to overpower it. They aimed to outmaneuver it. The humans provided the blueprint, but it was no doctrine, it was a philosophy: build nothing permanent, expect disruption, and embrace entropy as a condition of survival. They introduced fluid node logistics, where supplies moved continuously along irregular paths to avoid predictive targeting. They shared recursive code loops that fragmented command structures into self-healing clusters. Where the Council had built fortresses, the humans built swarms of their own, networks of drones, microsatellites, and mobile shield beacons that operated less like armies and more like neural systems. Each world became a variable in a dynamic equation, not a fixed defense point. Entire moons were hollowed out and reconfigured into mobile refit stations. Refugee vessels carried more than civilians. They carried processors designed to simulate local environmental shifts, feeding data back into real-time strategic models. The war effort wasn't centralized. It was distributed, fragmented by design, impossible to decapitate. Still, losses came fast. The first reconfrontation with the swarm ended in failure. 3 scout fleets vanished. One sent back partial telemetry showing the swarm had evolved, adapting to mimic friendly signal patterns. A trap. But instead of retreating into caution, the coalition responded by accelerating simulations. They didn't wait for full analysis. They adapted mid-strategy. The Drelt designed sensory decoys that broadcast corrupted swarm identifiers. The Vari introduced entropy grids, weapons that didn't destroy, but disrupted molecular cohesion. And from Earth, humanity unleashed its most unorthodox contribution: sacrifice units piloted by volunteers who lived entire alternate lifetimes in predictive simulations. then executed single-use countermeasures drawn from those artificial timelines. These weren't soldiers. They were temporal anchors, people who died knowing outcomes no one else could access. It worked. The swarm, designed to consume, began to falter when met with input it couldn't resolve. Conflict with purpose it couldn't decode. The very chaos that had once marked humanity as a liability now became the most effective resistance pattern. Species once divided by culture, physiology, or distrust operated under shared threat with coordinated intent. The Council, for all its bureaucratic origins, transformed into something agile. Delegates no longer convened in the chamber. They operated from mobile relay stations, field units, and live data nexuses. Decision cycles shrank from months to hours. Failures weren't punished. They were fed into learning loops that informed the next 10 operations. No speeches. No glory. Just movement. As momentum grew, a strange shift occurred. Hope returned, but it wasn't naive. It came in the form of resilience, the slow restoration of agency. For the first time, the swarm was pushed off a planet without orbital sterilization. A mining colony, written off weeks earlier, held its ground long enough for reinforcements to deploy terraforming inhibitors. Another sector, thought lost, re-established contact with rogue satellites repurposed as signal relays. Each success was minor in scale, devastating in implication. The tide didn't turn all at once. It didn't need to. The point was never to win outright. It was to create space for continuity. Space for something to endure. The swarm adapted again, less aggressive, more calculating, but now it was responding, not dictating. And the Council, with humanity embedded deep in its reformed core, no longer reacted passively. It provoked. It experimented. It evolved. In the final report compiled by Council historians, not for archives, but for remembrance, one entry stood alone. A simple annotation beside humanity's designation. Predictively volatile. Tactically indispensable. They had never been expected to lead. And in the end, they didn't. They infected the Council with the one trait no model had accounted for: refusal. Not of defeat, but of inevitability. Not of loss, but of paralysis. And that refusal spread faster than any swarm.